Hello and welcome to the Science-Based Targets Initiative webinar for the Net Zero Foundations for Financial Institutions draft launch for public consultation. Today we'll be introducing a new foundations draft that we've been working on for the past several months and presenting it to all of you for the start of our public consultation period here. This webinar today is being recorded, and we will be sending a copy of the presentation as well as the recording to all of you, and it will be available on the Science-Based Targets Initiative website. Please put your questions in the Q&A box of the webinar, and we will be addressing those towards the end of the webinar. So we have a fairly packed agenda today. The webinar will be an hour. And we'll begin with an introduction to the Science-Based Targets Initiative work on the financial sector. Then we'll describe the Net Zero Foundation's development process that we've been doing for the past several months and what we're looking at going forward. And then we're very fortunate to have remarks from both the UNEP Finance Initiative and GFANS. We'll then describe some of the key questions and opportunities for you to participate in our standard development process. And then we'll have some open Q&A and wrap it up. Today, we're very fortunate to have Eric Usher, who's the head of the UNEP Finance Initiative, with us, as well as Ronan Hodge, who's the head of risk management and returns at the COP26 Private Finance Hub. I'm Nate Aiden, and I'm joined by my SBTi colleague, Owen White. So thanks everyone for joining. So I'll just begin with some background here. For folks who aren't familiar, the Science-Based Targets Initiative is a collaboration between the UN Global Compact, the CDP, WWF, and the World Resources Institute. And we launched the Science-Based Targets Initiative back in 2015 in order to support private sector mitigation ambition. At the time, we also launched a call to action for companies and financial institutions to set science-based targets. And indeed, in that first year, we had a surprisingly large number of financial institutions commit to setting science-based targets for their investment and lending portfolios, as well as their operational emissions. We, however, didn't have methods and criteria specific to financial institutions until last October. That's October of 2020, when we launched our financial sector framework. And so now, in the past 6 years, you can see we've had fairly rapid growth. We're experiencing exponential growth now. And we now have more than 2,100 companies and financial institutions that have committed to setting science-based targets, of which more than 1,000 companies and financial institutions have science-based targets. Within the financial sector, we've had more than 120 financial institutions commit to setting science-based targets. And last month, we had our first 3 financial institutions have approved targets. And we were very pleased with the mix there to have a couple of banks, La Banque Postale and KB Group from Korea, as well as private equity firm EQT from Sweden. Generally, the project finds that the financial sector is a few years behind where companies are in terms of emissions inventories and target setting practices, but the financial sector is rapidly catching up. So after we published our target setting framework last year, we realized that there was a need to address this growing trend of net zero in the financial sector. And so we began to prepare this foundations guidance this year. And today we're pleased to be launching the foundations guidance draft for public comment. This is generally coming, as with our target setting practice, in the wake of our net zero standard development process for companies, where we launched our foundations paper for corporate net zero last year, and last month we launched our standard for corporate net zero target setting. as you can see, the initiative is growing quickly, and we have generally large leading companies and financial institutions participating. Why do we need a net zero standard for the financial sector? Well, what we found is that net zero target setting is becoming the new norm for climate ambition among financial institutions. However, there's a range of practices, especially in these three areas you can see on the slide here. So in terms of the boundary that's covered by these net zero targets, it varies in terms of whether they're covering all greenhouse gases or just CO2, which financing activities are included in the target formulation, and whether it covers the portfolio companies' operational emissions or their entire value chain emissions, that is scope 1 and 2 or scope 1, 2, and 3. Likewise, with the time frame, there's a range of practices here in terms of whether they're short or long-term target formulations. And then we also find a range of mitigation strategies that goes with these target announcements and formulations. And so we felt that it would be helpful to bring the Science-Based Targets Initiative practice and approach to financial institutions setting net zero targets. So that's one of our goals for this this process in terms of harmonization, making these targets verifiable in the same way that we do with corporate net zero targets now with the SBTi corporate net zero standard. Clearly, the Science-Based Targets Initiative is one of many initiatives within the financial sector, and we're very cognizant of our limited role in the space and the great work being done by other initiatives such as UNEP and GFANS. So again, we're very pleased to have both initiatives represented on the webinar today. Generally, our goal here within the SBT initiative is to promote harmonization across different financial sector initiatives and platforms. And so we see this standard as really advancing that goal. In terms of the process for producing the net zero standard for financial institution science-based targets, today is just the start of the public process. And so this draft that we'll be describing in the webinar today is going to be open for public consultation for the next 5 weeks until December 17th. And then we will be revising it and publishing the final draft in the first quarter of next year. And that will be a foundation for the standard, which will take about a year to develop and publish. And that will also include an extensive stakeholder engagement process with all of you and other stakeholders. So as I mentioned, the precedent here for this work within the Science-Based Targets Initiative is our corporate net zero standard, which we published last month. And this paper that we're sharing with you today is the financial sector equivalent of the Foundations for Corporate Net Zero Target Setting that we published in September of 2020. The primary goal, as you can see, of this Foundations paper is to lay out some key concepts and some key positions with regard to the many questions around defining net zero for financial institutions. So that's an overview of the SBT initiative and what we've been up to for the past couple of years. And now I will focus on this Net Zero Foundations development process along with my colleague. So some of the initial questions that we're addressing in this foundations piece are described on this slide. So for our company net zero standard, we focus exclusively on greenhouse gas emissions based metrics. However, with financial institutions, those metrics and data are not always widely available. And so one of the questions we're looking at today is which metrics are most suitable for financial institutions to demonstrate real world impact, which is the base goal of these targets, is to reduce emissions in the real economy. A second regards coverage. And so with the corporate net zero standard, we've had a lot of deliberations around coverage levels for scope 3 and scope 1 and 2. And we're having similar discussions around the coverage for financial institutions' portfolios. In terms of level of ambition, we've really settled clearly on the 1.5 degree pathways and levels of ambition for mitigation. And that's, again, the precedent for this work. But we're looking at how to calibrate that for different aspects of financial institution portfolios. One of the key concepts that arose from the corporate foundations paper that we published in 2020 was this distinction between compensation and neutralization. That is, emissions removals outside of and within the value chain of the company. And that's obviously a large question for financial institutions as well, and tends to be most focused on this discussion around carbon credits and how financial institutions can or cannot use carbon credits towards their net zero goals and formulations. Oops. So the way that we've structured this work is 5 levels in order just to show our thought processes and how different definitions and aspects of this work relate to each other. And so the first is that recognition that I mentioned earlier, that this is a well-established space and there's lots of good work happening in this space and there's no need to reinvent the wheel. And so we begin with a landscape analysis where we deconstruct some of the net zero targets and identify the strategies that are being used by financial institutions presently towards their net zero targets. The second is that we identify 5 guiding principles that we use for understanding the basic goals and direction of this work. We use those guiding principles to inform 3 different definitions that we've come up with for financial institutions net zero. And our current thinking that you'll see here is that these definitions are not mutually exclusive and that they can interrelate with each other. And so this is something that we're elaborating, but seeking feedback from all of you. The 4th level is transition metrics. And so the definitions will inform what types of transition metrics are most appropriate for different types of financial institutions and different aspects of their portfolios. Finally, this translates into target formulation and tracking. And this is something that's really finalized and stipulated in the criteria and standard process. But it's something that we're beginning to think about because there are implications from these principles, definitions, and metrics on the target criteria and formulation. And so we've elevated 4 of the key topics or target formulation areas for discussion and feedback in this 5th level. So the first is the role of carbon credits or offsets. The second is how financial institutions should treat their fossil fuel investments, what they need to do about that. It's obviously very topical nowadays. Another is the role of climate solutions. That's the idea that the financial sector has a very important role to play in allocating capital to climate solutions and how those should be treated within net zero targets by the financial institutions. And finally, the relationship between near-term targets, which at this point are science-based targets that we're already having approved through our existing criteria, and the longer-term science-based targets. With that, I will pass it to my colleague, Owen, to begin going through the landscape analysis and these levels of work here.
Thanks, Nate. Yes, I will go into a little bit of detail now on each of those 5 levels that Nate has outlined to just give a little bit more background of the thinking behind the development process and also to kind of point to some of the key questions we're seeking feedback on. So to start with this this first level of our landscape assessment, and as Nate mentioned, this is a very well-established space, and we now have over 130 trillion US dollars in assets have actually committed to net zero across all different types of financial institutions. But what we're really finding is that there's still little standardization on how we would actually evaluate and ultimately validate those forthcoming targets. And there still doesn't really remain any scientific consensus on what exactly net zero should mean for financial institutions. So the landscape assessment was really to kind of deconstruct some of the targets we're seeing, what financial institutions have actually published themselves, but also then to look into existing methodologies and frameworks around net zero target setting. And through this process, what we have done is we've identified kind of 6 broad approaches we're seeing to kind of how targets are being set in the financial sector. And that is kind of focused on just a decarbonization of financed emissions, also kind of seeing concepts of portfolio alignment now being used on a path to net zero. Financing of climate solutions is becoming a major topic within net zero targets, and of course using avoided emissions and various financing of negative emissions. So we're finding a lot of these different types of elements are being used within net zero targets, and the goal of the landscape assessment was kind of to classify and characterize those a little bit better, and that will then ultimately help us to feed into our definitions. The next level then really is around principles, and the principles are used to help us assess the different strengths and weaknesses of different target setting approaches. Ultimately, we want net zero target setting to be informed by science, and hence this is why we've developed these 5 specific principles. The first is on the concept of completeness. So we want net zero targets ultimately to cover all relevant financing activities of a given financial institution. The second concept is related to science-based ambition, that the ambition of these net zero targets must be aligned with and consistent with the ambition set out in 1.5 degree pathways. Our third principle then relates to the concept of impact. And a major topic of this is can net zero targets and can net zero standards help ensure that we see real world reductions via financing and not simply reductions within portfolio emissions. The fourth principle then is related to decarbonization and green. And this principle recognizes the important role financial institutions play also in scaling up finance for new climate solutions and the climate solutions that are ultimately necessary for achieving a net zero economy. And our final principle then is around that we want to ensure that the net zero targets incentivize and enable financial institutions to use their kind of unique roles and responsibilities to influence and engage companies in the real economy. So these 5 principles then really kind of form the bedrock of how we will ultimately develop our definitions. And as Nate mentioned before, we have come up with 3 different formulations of definitions of how net zero could be defined for the financial sector. How we came up with these was to look at the various strategies from the landscape assessment and then to compare them to the principles we've just outlined. So these definitions right now are not mutually exclusive, and we do want to also explore through this process how they could be used in parallel, and some of them might be more relevant to other types of financial institutions. So it's one area that we do want to get kind of feedback on during this consultation process. So there's the first of the definitions concerns kind of financed emissions. So this is when net zero targets and claims are simply based in terms of the financed emissions of a financial institution. So it takes a similar approach to the corporate standard, where net zero would ultimately be defined based on financed emissions being reduced along 1.5 degree pathways, and that any residual financed emissions then would be neutralized with carbon removals. The second approach to the definition, it doesn't concern simply financed emissions, but it concerns the concept of portfolio alignment, where net zero claims are based on the relative alignment of individual companies within an FI's portfolio. And net zero would only be achieved when you have all companies in that portfolio actually achieving net zero status aligned with the net zero corporate standard. And the final definition then we have is a kind of a much broader approach, which we're terming portfolio contribution. And this specifically recognizes the financial institutions' role both in providing financing for decarbonization, but also then explicitly reallocating finance towards climate solutions. And the idea being that net zero will be defined in terms of decarbonization financing and climate solution financing being consistent with the rates required to meet global climate goals. So these are currently our three broad approaches that are not mutually exclusive, but we want to explore how these could be used and how they're relevant to different types of financial institutions. And I think we have a poll now that we can actually just bring up on the screen. So please take a moment to click through what you think, which definition is most and best suited to financial institutions to help define net zero. So we'll come back to those results just a little bit later, but I'm just going to move through now to the next slide on the metrics. So this is the next element of our kind of 5-step process. Whereas we've looked at the different approaches to defining net zero, and the next element would be to understand what kind of metrics could be used and to track progress against these different definitions. So we've identified a range of metrics that are currently being used, and we've kind of grouped them into these different definitions. So when we look at from a finance emissions perspective, we have a lot of these greenhouse gas-based metrics that many of us would be very familiar with in terms of absolute portfolio emissions and portfolio intensity and sector-based physical intensity. So these are all metrics based on past performance, carbon footprinting data of portfolio companies. We then have these, I would say, a bit newer metrics that are being used for portfolio alignment. These are forward-looking metrics, typically based on companies' targets and transition plans. Common ones now being the implied temperature rise metric. And then finally, for portfolio contribution, these again are even different metrics which are not based on greenhouse gases or forward-looking data, but they're based on the economic activities of the underlying companies. So common approaches now we're seeing are these kind of new taxonomies, which help to classify a company's kind of greenness based on the type of economic activities they're involved in. So we have in the foundations paper, we have assessed a number of these metrics to understand, how they're being used and their kind of suitability to some of these definitions. Also, a major part of this work is to evaluate how we will ultimately link these metrics to a target. So while we're very familiar with looking at greenhouse gas metrics, and they can be linked quite easily to global climate scenarios, we have a big question when it comes to other types of metrics, how we could define the ambition of a target that ultimately tracks that metric. So particularly when we're looking at kind of climate solutions and portfolio contribution, the question is, how do we track the ambition of those, and how do we define ambition based on certain types of metrics? So this is definitely now we would like your feedback on during the consultation process to understand what metrics do you see as most useful, and how could these given metrics become part of science-based targets. Great. So just the results of the poll have come up now based on the definition. So I think there's kind of strong support initially for the financed emissions-based approach. It's certainly the simplest approach and very common we're seeing, but I think also here the idea that the combination of two or more options is the most popular vote, and that's something that we're also considering is to understand how these different definitions could actually overlap, and the fact that you could be looking at financed emissions from a given financial institution, and also then tracking, for example, the alignment of their portfolios. So this is something we would like to kind of tease out a little bit more in the consultation process and kind of get some feedback on how these definitions could also apply to different types of financial institutions. And then just to finish this section on the last element of the process is on different elements of targets that will have to be considered. So we have kind of 4 key elements that we've outlined and discussed in the paper. The first being on the concept of how fossil fuels and fossil fuel financing should be addressed within net zero targets. Again, there's a lot of different options right now. We're seeing different approaches being taken by financial institutions. The second element is on this role of climate solutions. The SBTi has typically been focused on decarbonization and emission reductions. So the investing in new climate solutions is a slightly different approach. And we also want to understand, should these be part of a net zero standard? And then how would we define metrics and ambition to actually track the rate of capital allocation to climate solutions? The third element is the always contentious issue of kind of offsetting and the use of carbon credits. We've done a lot of thinking on this topic via our corporate standard on how carbon credits should apply to companies. So as part of this work that we're going to be seeing, based on those precedents, how can we apply this to financial institutions, and what changes should we make given the unique role of financial institutions in this space? And then finally, on the concept of the near-term target framework and how that should be updated to align with the new recommendations from this net zero work. So I'll come back and I'll discuss those a little bit later on in more detail and point to the survey and some of the key questions we're looking for. But for now, I'll hand you back to Nate.
Great. Thank you very much, Owen, for the excellent overview of our framework foundations development process. So now I'm very pleased to introduce again Eric Usher, who's the head of the UNEP Finance Initiative, and Ronan Hodge, who's the head of the Risk Management and Returns Group at the COP26 Private Finance Hub. I'll pass it to Eric first for some remarks. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Nate and Ewan. I joined UNEP in 2016, just after Paris was signed. And for those who don't know, UNEP, we're a partnership between the UN and the finance sector, which over the years has established many of the UN frameworks responsible for finance, including the PRI in 2006, which was done with the Global Compact, the PSI, Principles Sustainable Insurance, in 2012, and most recently the Principles Responsible Banking in 2019. Now, when I joined back then, UNEP, our climate team, I would say, was sort of regrouping after early efforts with actually Cynthia and others at WRI under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and a first effort to establish norms around financed emissions, and which essentially failed. The finance sector just wasn't ready back then. Now, of course, topped, I think, by the Finance Day last week, and it's quite remarkable how things have changed. And the fantastic progress, headlighted by GFANS, and we're going to hear more about that shortly, but also, linked to that, very important announcements from the Financial Stability Board, from the IFRS, and more, that we really are seeing overall a realignment within the financial system in a manner that's going to help us hopefully move in the direction that we're all focused on. I think it's clear this really is the decade in which we need the most ambitious of climate action, and the financial community is, I believe, beginning to react to this call. The last 10 days since COP started really have been pivotal, and there's been an explosion of finance committed to this net zero world. And also we would acknowledge, quite a bit of criticism of the credibility of these commitments. So, this is, I think within this notion, this is why we at UNEP and WI, and I think others under SBTi and more, we've been, from our side, we've really been pushing for not only net zero commitments, but certainly the actions part. And they have to be, referring a little bit to what Nate has mentioned, or Ewan, based on science. They need to be consistent, they need to be transparent, and they need to involve not so much the 2050 focus, but the short-term targets that imply action, which is going to happen now. So GFANS, over 450 financial firms managing, in the order of 130 trillion in assets, have now joined the big tent of net zero commitment. We in UNEP, we convene a little over half of this amount under, first of all, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and then, which is 2 years old now, but then more recently, the NESBA, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which together are investing or managing about half of those assets out of the 130. We also have the most recently launched Net Zero Insurance Alliance, which manages a significant portion of the global gross written premium from an insurance underwriter's perspective. This is, I think, important observations. This is a global movement. European institutions certainly were early movers in this space, but this is no longer a European thing. Interestingly, for instance, the Asset Owner Alliance, the fastest growth today is actually in Japan. And the Banking Alliance, early on, we had the top 10 largest banks in Europe were signed on. Once again, maybe not so much a surprise considering the leadership from the region, but 2 weeks before COP opened, we got the 10th out of 10 of the largest North American banks. So the US and Canadian banks signed on, which is a big development to get them really focused in this space. And it doesn't stop there. We have 6 of the 10 largest Latin American banks, 3 out of the 10 of the largest Asian players. And of course, not only the big ones, there are also a lot of smaller and very innovative banks within that grouping as well. So this is a global movement. It's not only developed, it's also developing emerging markets. Everybody's at the table. Now, you know, in these alliances, we're working to sort of ensure how can we swiftly work towards science-based and credible transitions to net zero, which obviously, as Ned has been explaining, you know, is the basic foundations for the need for this paper for consultation, which has been launched now. Now, 3 days before COP, the Asset Owner Alliance released the first ever report on near-term finance targets for net zero of any group. This was the first 29 members who met their timing deadline. They were required to issue this within 12 months of joining. And they essentially have moved from commitments to action by setting concrete targets for 2025. This is less than 4 years from today. The other members of the Alliance, they all have 12 months and they will issue within that of their joining. Now, the investors committed mostly in the high end of the possible range of 1.5 ambition reduction, which means essentially above 25% reductions across the portfolio. This is ahead of what most governments have committed to doing on this time frame. And I think for the topic of this consultation paper, you know, being released now, the most relevant foundational document that we can provide is the Asset Owner Alliance, the 2025 Target Setting Protocol, which they released in past January. It was that protocol that they used to then go forward and ultimately issue these 2025 targets. The newer banking and insurance alliances will be developing their own target setting protocols. They learn from each other, but they are specific to the nature of their business. And they also have strict timelines to adhere to in when these targets will be set. They will be focusing on the 2030. Essentially, well, some would say no, but setting targets for 2025 starts to get more and more difficult the closer you get to the date, obviously. So lots of devil in the detail, but I think suffice to say that, you know, this, we believe, is the beginning of a rather abrupt U-turn in the economy, and you know, one that the planet really so urgently needs, as we're increasingly hearing. I think by setting 2025 target asset owners, you know, they induce immediate action from their portfolio companies, from their service providers, and their asset managers. So it sends a very clear signal. Now, we at the UN, we ask financiers, you know, that you take a holistic approach to immediate actions. You know, investors have responded by setting targets on overall portfolio emissions reductions. These need to start becoming sector by sector emission thresholds, particularly in the hard to abate sectors. They need specific targets around company engagement, and we need to be tracking the growth of funding which investors provide to climate positive ventures. To do this, we need to be working with others, including indeed Science-Based Targets Initiative. They have been the first collaborator that the Asset Owner Alliance has started to work with 2 years ago. And we have been working very closely since and providing sort of rigorous guidance to financial institutions on the nature of their commitments, how they turn them into action. We recently released an input paper to the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, which provides 11 criteria for credible net zero commitments from the financial sector. Very pleased that SBTi contributed to this paper. And we're very pleased to finally see and welcome today SBTi's finance foundations paper, I think we see provides a well-grounded and additional contribution to the space. Let's work. We need to work together. We can cut through the noise and provide financial institutions, a key actor in the economy, with the credible pathways they need to achieve to deliver for their bottom line and for the planet, the race to zero. Thank you. Back to you, Nate.
Thanks very much, Eric, for those inspiring words and very helpful background. It's good to have some sense of where we're coming from and how things are changing. So I think there are positive changes afoot as well. And so it's really helpful to have that context. Now we'll turn to Ronan Hodge, who is the head of risk management returns at the COP26 Private Finance Hub and is representing GFANS here. Welcome, Ronan.
Thank you, Nate, and a pleasure to be at today's launch as well. As Nate says, Ronan Hodge, I'm part of Mark Carney's team working on the private finance agenda for COP26, and today specifically representing the team's role as Secretariat for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANS as it's quickly becoming known. I think Eric's done a great job of describing the big tent of financial sector firms within GFANS now, and at the core really of bringing these firms together is the need for credible and robust commitments and plans to align finance with net zero. And so the consultation launched today is an exciting development. Stepping back briefly, GFANS was launched back in April as a way to bring together existing net zero financial initiatives, some of the ones that Eric describes, and also catalyze the creation of new ones to provide a sector-wide coalition. And in this way, GFANS provides a forum for leading financial institutions to really accelerate the transition to a net zero global economy. And the focus from the outset has really been on broadening, deepening and raising net zero ambitions across the financial system and demonstrating the collective commitment to supporting companies and countries in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, indeed, the breadth of firms that are part of GFANS captures part of the challenge in ensuring a coordinated and robust approach, capturing the nuances of the different business models that are involved. The alliances now cover banks and insurers, pension funds, asset managers, export credit agencies and credit rating agencies, stock exchanges, index providers, investment consultants, auditors, and others. So it's quite the ecosystem, as it were, of the financial sector. And what's really key is that we bring consistency to the commitment making and drive up standards over time as well. Now, in this respect, the work of GFANS really is standing on the shoulders of innumerable organisations and individuals who've made it their mission over many years to tackle questions about the role of the financial sector in climate change and call for its support of the net zero transition. And that's why the GFANS advisory panel was established. This draws together 20 climate experts from non-governmental organisations around the world to ensure that the work within GFANS is held to the highest standards of ambition while keeping climate science really at the heart of all of this. And SBTi is a valued member of that advisory panel, and we very much welcome the work in this challenging area. I think it's going to be really key. It will bring more credibility to net zero commitment setting in the financial sector, and in doing so ensure that finance is having a real world impact on achieving a net zero global economy. I'd echo some of the points from the paper as well. I think SBTi's identification of the critical role that finance has to play in supporting the global economy's transition to net zero is terribly important. I think that unique influence over other actors that they're providing capital and services to is what makes the financial sector kind of a really key player here. And in this respect, I think it's really important. We welcome this sort of philosophy on needing to incentivize a whole economy transition through forward-looking approaches to decarbonisation. I think the key point here was really that reducing financed emissions should not really occur at the expense of not financing the transition of the wider economy. And so I think it would be key that as net zero targets for financial institutions are developed and we get this robustness around them, that they're really incentivizing engagement with portfolio companies in terms of reducing their own emissions, similarly consistent with that 1.5 degree pathway and setting the right science-based net zero targets as well. I think to sort of echo some of Eric's points as well, I think what we've seen at COP26 in recent days is hopefully the passing of a real watershed moment on the role of finance as we strive towards this net zero future. We've got around 40% of the financial system by assets committed now to net zero through this range of alliances. But in many ways, you know, the hard work starts now as these commitments turned into action. And just to sort of briefly mention some of the things that GFANS is looking to pursue over the coming year and beyond, there's sort of 7 critical areas that we're looking at. The first is around catalyzing alignment on sectoral pathways, which are a key element to kind of how some of this challenge and assessment, I suppose, of net zero plans is going to come about. The other is setting out the financial sector's own expectations of real economy transition plans. There's this driving of convergence around best practice for financial institution transition plans, to which this paper is really a really key kind of ingredient, I hope. And also supporting the development and effective implementation of portfolio alignment metrics, and that was some of the aspects that Owen touched on in the presentation as well. Also, another key element is going to be developing the frameworks and approaches that mobilize private capital to the rest of the world, the emerging markets, developing countries in particular. And another thing that GFANS is already started doing, we put a call to action out last month, is advocating for public policy need in terms of accelerating the investment to net zero. Like what's the financial sector want to see from public policy makers? And finally, just continuing to really broaden the nature. A number of financial firms that are committed to net zero through these alliances. So to wrap up, really, I mean, we see SBTi as a key partner of the alliances, members of GFANS on this journey. We look forward to sort of working in continued close collaboration, and for GFANS members that are hopefully on the line, and other stakeholders, just really encourage you to read the draft. It's a great piece of work. Input to the feedback survey. And join the online workshops that have been scheduled over coming weeks as well. And I think this can be a really important way to get the impetus going now from COP26 into COP27, hopefully. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ronan, for your excellent comments. And we are extremely grateful to both GFANS and UNEP-FI for the ongoing collaboration, and look forward to working with you on this process. So now, before we open it to questions from participants here, we're just going to actually go through some of our key questions that we'd like all of you to think about, and that you can eventually answer in the survey. But I'll pass it back to Owen to talk about some of those questions.
Thanks, Nate. Yes, as you mentioned, that we do have the survey that will accompany the draft paper. And there's a few elements in particular that we would like feedback on. So in addition to the principles and the definitions we've outlined before today, there's 3 elements we're going to talk about now: fossil fuels, climate solutions, and the role of carbon credits. So I want to kind of take you quickly through some of those key questions we have. So first, on the role of fossil fuels, obviously fossil fuels still play a major role in global emissions. And the question now is how explicitly they should be addressed within any net zero target setting framework. Under our current approach, we have this kind of disclosure transition phase out model where any companies or financial institutions setting near-term targets, they would have to disclose what is their financing of fossil fuels, and also to disclose their plan to reduce those over time. The question now for this net zero work is, should there be explicit targets placed on fossil fuel financing in addition to other net zero targets, or is it sufficient to capture fossil fuels as part of wider portfolio level targets? So this is really a question on the transparency and the role of fossil fuels, and from a kind of an accountability perspective, do you think that it is important for us to have explicit targets that we can track on fossil fuel financing? The next element then is on this role of climate solutions. And as we've already discussed a little bit today, the SBTi has traditionally focused on decarbonization, and we have defined, the rates of emission reductions over time, and being able to compare those to global climate scenarios. However, when we're looking at climate solutions, the financial institutions play a particularly important role in scaling up finance, and it is one of kind of our core principles here, is that we have to recognize this element. Our question now really here is how explicit does this need to be as part of any net zero standard for financial institutions? So this would include both the role of climate solutions, should there be specific targets, and then ultimately what kind of metrics should we use, and if how would we define ambition? So the key thing is, how do you define science-based ambition for a climate solutions target that is not based on any of the classic greenhouse gas metrics that the SBTi has currently used? So we do have a poll question here, just to kind of quickly gauge the opinion of, do you think, again, for the credibility of net zero targets for the financial sector, should there be explicit targets based on increasing financing to climate solutions? So please share your thoughts now, and this will be a core element of the consultation, where we want to get a little bit more feedback on the metrics and indeed the approaches to defining ambition as well. So in the meantime, I'll just move on to the final point on the role of carbon credits. A lot of this thinking is informed by our work in the corporate standard, and just to sort of highlight that, first of all, kind of carbon credits, can be purchased as a replacement for reducing value chain emissions, and this is often kind of referred to as offsetting. And while the SBTi and our corporate net zero standard is very strictly focused on deep decarbonization, carbon credits do play a role, and there's two elements and two approaches where they can be used. So first, in the transition to net zero, companies can opt to purchase carbon credits to support society's overall net zero goals, but those purchase of carbon credits cannot be counted towards the company's net zero claims. But at net zero, it is anticipated that once companies reduce emissions along 1.5 degree pathways, they can use carbon dioxide removals to neutralize any remaining residual emissions. And these may be achieved via the purchase of kind of high quality carbon credits. Our question now is, taking this precedent from the company perspective, how do we apply this to financial institutions? And the table here just sort of highlights how we're looking at this from both kind of this neutralization at net zero and also the role in the transition to net zero. So while companies then have to neutralize their residual emissions within their value chains, and that may be done through the purchase of high quality carbon removal credits, we would see the same approach being used for financial institutions for their scope 1 and 2 and their scope 3 non-financed emissions. The question we have now is where does neutralization and how does neutralization come about when we're looking at financed emissions, and what are the different ways to achieve neutralization within a given portfolio? There's two options that we're exploring right now. The first being that neutralization would take place at a portfolio level via the direct financing of carbon removal. So this would be exclusive of carbon credits, and it would focus on direct financing of carbon removal projects, and that could be used then to neutralize any residual portfolio-wide emissions. Or the second approach being that neutralization would have to occur within the portfolio company value chains. So in this case, the net zero, or the neutralization burden, if you will, is placed back on the portfolio companies, and the role of the financial institution is simply to engage those companies so that they themselves and each portfolio company achieves net zero. So there are kind of two approaches we're looking at. In terms of the transition to net zero and this beyond value chain mitigation, again, carbon credits can be purchased as additional measures, but they do not count currently towards any net zero claims. And this is sort of our default approach now for both companies and financial institutions. But the next slide will be kind of outline a few questions of how this might change for the kind of feedback we're looking for the consultation. So we recognize that in the transition to net zero, FIs do play a very important role. They provide the needed liquidity and the market mechanisms as well to facilitate the financing of carbon removals. So one of our questions here is, what role should FIs have when it comes to financing carbon removals in the transition to net zero? How should they be captured in any net zero targets? And should this diverge from our company precedent? And then the final point then being at net zero, and from a neutralization perspective, how can neutralization be achieved within a given portfolio? And as I mentioned, should that take place at a portfolio wide level, or is it best to shift that within portfolio value chains and have an engagement-led approach? So there are a couple of the key questions we're looking to answer as part of the consultation on carbon credits, which I think is a really still a very valid and timely question. So that's all on these points. I'll hand you back to Nate just to discuss the consultation process and our kind of timelines for the next stages of this work.
Great, thank you, Owen. And just briefly, I'll acknowledge thanks, folks, for participating in the Zoom poll. It looks like 3/4 of folks agree that there should be a green target component for that Zoom poll. So that is obviously a big change for us. And Owen has been describing some of the key issues that we've identified in this foundation's development process. So in terms of the process, we have uploaded the draft for public comment today, and it's available on the website. We can share that link with the follow-up email, but it's available on our website. And that is paired with an online survey that we are welcoming all of you to complete to provide your feedback on this draft. In addition to that, we will have 2 online public workshops next month. So one will be on December 7th, and that's sort of oriented towards Americas and Europe. And the other is the following week on December 13th, which is oriented towards Europe and Asia. And we would welcome folks to join those 2 workshops where we'll be discussing these questions and the details of the foundation's paper in more detail, more depth. One other thing to mention is that this net zero work that we're embarking on, this net zero standard development process, is independent of and in addition to the SBT financial sector framework that we launched last year. That framework and those criteria are already being used, as I mentioned, to assess the first science-based targets from financial institutions and will continue to be the basis of the SBT assessment for financial institutions in terms of that very active pipeline that we have now of submissions from financial institutions. I'll just begin the Q&A with one question we got from Anthony Chan. Thank you for the question. He asks, won't the portfolio alignment approach result in concentration of finance in bigger, more established organizations with the wherewithal to implement the corporate net zero standard? He's asking if that's a good thing or not. And indeed, there is some challenge here around capacity. And the Science Based Targets Initiative has addressed that challenge partially by creating new resources for small and medium enterprises and broadening our engagement methods to also include temperature rating. So this is something that we're constantly thinking about and aware of, but it's something that we are welcoming feedback on and welcome additional conversation and suggestions. I'll pass it to Kylie to MC us through the rest of the questions.
Thank you, Nate, and thank you everyone for being so active in the Q&A. We're pulling questions now, so I'm going to pass one to Cynthia Cremis, our technical director at SBTi, to answer what's the difference between science-based and net zero targets.
Everyone. So the difference between net zero and science-based targets. So we see science-based targets are essentially these near-term 5 to 10 year targets that the initiative has been solely focused on up till recently. With the launch of our net zero standard for companies, we now also enable these long-term science-based targets to achieve net zero. And so now we have these near-term and the long-term SBTs for companies. And the long-term SBTs are the ones that enable the achievement of net zero.
Great, thank you, Cynthia. I'm going to pass back to Nate quickly. Will there be guidance to help FIs who are setting SBTs now to step change to setting net zero targets? For example, by mapping the similarities and differences in methodologies.
Can I answer that one?
Yeah, go for it, Cynthia.
Yeah. So I think the standard that we launched a few weeks ago for companies does just that, and it shows how to set us have net zero targets validated. You also have to set near-term science-based targets and clarifies which methods that you can use. Essentially, we enable the same methods for both near-term SBTs and these long-term SBTs. But in the net zero standard, it provides this very comprehensive approach with all the criteria to set both near-term and long-term targets, and maps how the two targets are aligned in terms of which scenarios we use, which methods you use to set these targets.
Indeed. And that's clearly the precedent for us. But over the next several months, this will be part of the standard development process and stakeholder engagement discussion that we're just starting today. So this is definitely on our radar as one of the things that we need to address with this standard.
Great. And then another one, will there be detailed guidance on defining climate solutions and their relevance to a science-based net zero standard?
Yeah, I'm going to take that one, Kylie. Indeed, so that will be part of the work is defining, first of all, what is a climate solution? And I mean, there has been a lot of work done already on this via the likes of the European taxonomies and equivalent work. But we want to specify a little bit more what would you regard as climate solutions, and then ultimately the metrics we would use to track that, and then indeed if we can link that to a science-based ambition. So the question for us is the SBTi has been very much focused on decarbonization, and before we will determine whether we can have science-based climate solution targets is really to understand the metrics, the credibility behind those metrics, and if we can actually define what the ambition would be. But we will be providing a little bit more detail in the foundations paper and going forward on the role of climate solutions and how they can be how they can be part of net zero standards.
Fantastic. And then our next one, at COP26 last week, the UN Secretary General said he would be establishing an expert group to propose clear standards to analyze net zero commitments from non-state actors, citing credibility as an issue. Does SBTi have any insight, thoughts about this? Could SBTi be an input or source of these standards? Cynthia, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can take that one. Yeah, so we really welcome this announcement for the UN Secretary General. I think it'll help bring a lot of more credibility to all the net zero claims that are out there, and hopefully drive some consistency and harmonization across the system, and provide or incentivize more accountability for these net zero targets. We expect that our net zero standard for corporates will help to inform whatever is developed by the UN Secretary General, and I think it provides a really good framework for what a credible system looks like for validating corporate net zero targets, and also provides a lot of transparency around these targets. What SBTi still is working to develop is more of an accountability mechanism, and we're going to be working on that through developing an MRV system over the next year. So we also hope that will help to inform whatever the UN Secretary General develops in regards to accountability. And then as we develop this net zero standard for financial institutions, we hope it can be also a valuable part of the future system that will be used to provide accountability for these net zero targets.
Thank you, Cynthia. And we're at the top of the hour, so I'll close out with one last question. And I see Ronan still here, so if he wants to contribute. But to what extent do GFANS and SBTi collaborate on the finance net zero standard? And to what extent do you envision GFANS signatories committing to the SBTi? Ronan, if you want to answer on that, or Nate?
On this particular standard is the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it'll be for members of the alliances to make that judgment. I think what we're trying to do is make sure that some of the key challenges that arise across how financial institution transition plans are formed are addressed. And I think this work, this paper, is going some way to trying to tackle that, and by putting it out for public comment, starting to get that sense of what the wider market wants as well. So I think it's a bit of a live question as to whether that'll be something that firms will decide whether they need to do or not. But I think I think SBTi has an awful lot of credibility in this space. I think it would be a natural thing for many financial institutions to want to use this standard as it develops.
Thanks, Ronan. Yeah, just to final word on that is certainly we agree, and the GFANS members are some of our key constituents in terms of the leading global financial institutions that are actually implementing this. And so this is one of the special characteristics of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, that we do work with the private sector to develop our resources and implement them. And we look forward to continuing to do that with GFANS, UNEP-FI, and other stakeholders throughout the financial sector. So I just want to thank everyone for joining today, and we look forward to seeing you in our subsequent workshops, and hope that you will read the draft and fill out the survey. Thanks again.